I was grading papers. At my own kitchen table, 40 years of teaching had made it a habit when I heard my two sons in the hallway, voices low, certain I couldn't hear. "She'll never see it coming," Ryan said, and for one long, terrible second, he was right. But only for that second. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, the same way I had sat at 1,000 tables before it, papers spread in front of me, red pen in hand, the quiet hum of the refrigerator keeping me company. 40 years of teaching high school English had left me with habits I couldn't shake, even in retirement. Grading had always been my way of thinking. The act of reading someone else's words, carefully, looking for what they meant beneath what they said, it had shaped the way I moved through the world long after the classroom was behind me. The kitchen smelled like the chicken soup I had made earlier that afternoon, the kind my mother used to make on cold nights in October, heavy with thyme and bay leaf. Outside, the last light of the day was fading over the rooftops of our Charleston neighborhood, turning the sky that particular shade of deep orange I had always loved. It was the kind of evening that felt safe, ordinary, the kind you don't think twice about until something breaks it open. I heard them before I saw them. My two sons had let themselves in, through the side door, something they had done their whole lives, something I had never once minded. I could hear their voices in the hallway, just around the corner, from the kitchen, low and close together, the way they used to talk as boys, when they didn't want me to hear what they were planning. Ryan, my oldest, had his father's voice, deep and certain, the kind that filled a room without trying. Connor, 3 years younger, was quieter by nature, more of a listener than a talker. I set my pen down without thinking. Something in the tone of Ryan's voice made me go still. Not loud, not angry, just certain. "She'll never see it coming," he said. 3 seconds. That's how long it took for those 5 words to rearrange everything I thought I understood about my life. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My hand was still resting on the paper in front of me, and I remember thinking with strange clarity that the student who had written it had used the word invisible 3 times in a single paragraph. I had been about to circle it in red. I didn't circle it. I sat very still and I listened. Connor said something I couldn't fully make out. His voice was softer, and the distance swallowed part of it. But I caught enough. Words like timing and before she realizes, and something that sounded like the accounts. Ryan responded with the kind of calm that comes not from patience, but from confidence. The confidence of a man who believes he has already won something. Then footsteps. They were moving toward the kitchen. I picked up my pen. I looked down at the paper in front of me, and by the time Ryan appeared in the doorway, I was reading. Or at least, I looked like I was reading. Because that is something else 40 years of teaching had given me the ability to appear completely composed while my mind was working at full speed somewhere else entirely. "Hey, Mom." Ryan leaned against the doorframe the way he always did, hands in his pockets, easy smile in place. He was 41 years old and still had the kind of face that made people trust him immediately. I had always been proud of that. Now, for the first time, I looked at it differently. "Hey, sweetheart." My voice came out warm and unhurried. I was quietly amazed at myself. Connor followed him in pulling out a chair across from me. He was quieter than his brother always had been, the kind of man who watched a room before he spoke in it. He gave me a small smile and asked if there was any soup left. I told him to help himself. He did. We talked for about 20 minutes. Nothing remarkable. Ryan mentioned something about work. Connor asked about a neighbor's dog that had been barking lately. I answered everything, the way I always had, present, engaged, unhurried. I asked about their wives. I refilled my coffee. I laughed at the right moments. And the entire time, something inside me was very quietly becoming something new. It wasn't anger. Not yet. Anger is loud and immediate, and what I felt in those 20 minutes was the opposite of loud. It was the feeling of a lens, slowly coming into focus, the gradual sharpening of an image you had been looking at for a long time without fully seeing. Because the truth was, this hadn't come from nowhere. There had been questions lately, small ones, at first, the kind that sound like concern, until you hear them often enough to recognize the shape beneath them. Questions about my accounts, about the properties, about whether I had updated my paperwork recently. I had answered them all. I had thought nothing of it. Now I was thinking of it. After they left, I walked them to the door the way I always did. I hugged them both. I told Ryan to drive safe, because there was rain coming. I told Connor the soup was better the next day if he wanted to take some home. They laughed. They waved. The side door closed behind them with the same familiar click it had made for 30 years. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sound of Ryan's car pulling out of the driveway. Then I walked back to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and placed my red pen very carefully on top of the ungraded papers. I didn't grade anything else that night. I sat in the quiet of the kitchen, the soup smell fading, the sky fully dark. Now, the refrigerator still humming. And I thought, not frantically, not emotionally, the way I had always thought through problems that mattered, slowly, carefully, from every angle. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. Most people have called me Ellie for as long as I can remember. I am 67 years old. I taught high school English in Charleston, South Carolina for 4 decades. And before that, I was the daughter of a woman who raised 3 children on a school teacher's salary and never once let any of us feel the weight of it. I have been a wife, a mother, a widow. I have built things and lost things and held on to what mattered. I know what it sounds like when someone is telling the truth, and I know just as clearly what it sounds like when they are not. That night, I didn't sleep, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in the dark of my bedroom, staring at the ceiling, the way you do when your mind refuses to let something go, turning it over and over, examining every surface, every edge. The house was still around me. Just the old oak tree outside the window, its branches shifting in the October wind, brushing lightly against the glass, the way they had for nearly 40 years. I turned onto my side and looked at the empty half of the bed. Robert's side. I had never been able to sleep in the middle, even after all this time. Some spaces feel too important to fill. I closed my eyes, and I let myself go back. We came to Charleston in the autumn of 1984, newly married and carrying everything we owned in the back of a borrowed truck. I was 27. Robert was 29, freshly hired as a cardiologist at a hospital downtown. And so proud of it, he practically glowed. I had just accepted a teaching position at a local high school, a job I had wanted since I was old enough to understand what wanting something felt like. We had almost nothing. A mattress on the floor of a rented apartment, a secondhand sofa the color of old mustard, a kitchen table with one wobbling leg that Robert joked kept us humble. He was like that, always finding the grace in the imperfect thing. We saved carefully and spent thoughtfully, the way people do when they know that what they are building matters more than how fast they build it. Robert worked long hours at the hospital. I stayed up late preparing lessons, reading student essays, learning my craft the same way he was learning his. On weekends, we walked the neighborhoods of Charleston together, learning the streets, learning the history, learning each other in the way that only ordinary time can teach you. We bought our house in the spring of 1989, a 2-story colonial on a tree-lined street, white with dark green shutters, a front porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. It needed work, but Robert walked through every room with his hands in his pockets and that quiet expression he wore when something pleased him deeply. "This is it," he said, standing in the empty living room. "You're sure?" I asked. He looked at me. "I've never been more sure of anything." That was Robert. He didn't say things he didn't mean, and he didn't mean things halfway. Over the years, what we built together became something solid, not just in property or savings, though we were careful and fortunate in both, but in the way we moved through the world side by side. He respected my judgment the way some men only pretend to. He asked for my counsel and actually listened. When I made decisions he wouldn't have made himself, he trusted me enough not to interfere. We never quite said it aloud, but we had agreed on the most important thing, that neither of us belonged to the other. We chose each other every single day, and that choosing was the whole point. We raised our 2 sons in that house, watched them grow into men we believed we could be proud of. We celebrated and grieved and laughed in those rooms. We grew older inside those walls, the way people do when they are paying attention to their lives. And then one morning in March, 4 years ago, Robert was gone. His heart had been struggling for longer than he told me, which was so deeply like him, that even in my grief, I couldn't find anger in it. He was a cardiologist who had spent his career caring for other people's hearts while quietly managing his own. He left this world in his sleep, in his own bed, in the house we had chosen together, 30 years before. The doctor said it had been peaceful. I chose to believe them. Grief isn't loud the way people expect. It arrives quietly and makes itself at home in the smallest places, in the second coffee cup you no longer need in the side of the bed, that stays perfectly made in the silence of Sunday mornings when there is no one left to share the paper with. I learned to live inside that silence. I kept the accounts in order, managed our properties, maintained the routines that gave my days their shape. I was not fragile. Robert had never once treated me as though I were, and I saw no reason to become something he had never believed I was. But there was something he had said to me a few years before he left, one of those quiet evenings on the front porch when conversation drifts naturally into the territory of real things. He set down his glass and looked at me with the expression he reserved for what mattered most. "Ellie," he said, "if something ever feels wrong, not wrong like a hard season, but wrong in the way your whole body knows, before your mind catches up, trust it. Don't talk yourself out of it. Don't let anyone convince you that you're imagining things. Just trust it." I looked at him. That's a strange thing to say. He picked up his glass again. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I'd rather say it and have you not need it than stay silent and have you wish I hadn't." I hadn't thought about those words in a very long time. Lying there in the dark, the oak trees shifting softly outside, I thought about them now. Robert was gone, but he never truly left me unprotected. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. That's the thing about certain kinds of change, the kind that matters, the kind that alters the shape of your life in ways you don't fully understand until you're already standing on the other side of it. It doesn't arrive with an announcement. It doesn't knock on the front door and introduce itself. It comes quietly through the side entrance, wearing familiar clothes, using the voice of someone you love. Looking back now, I can trace it to somewhere around 2 years ago. Not a single moment, but a season, a gradual shift in the temperature of things that I noticed the way you notice the days getting shorter in late summer. Not dramatically, just incrementally, until one morning you realize the light is different and you can't quite remember when it changed. It started with questions. Ryan had always been the more forward of my 2 sons, direct in the way his father had been, though without the gentleness that made Robert's directness feel like a gift rather than a demand. After Robert passed, Ryan had stepped into a version of himself that he seemed to believe the situation required. More present, more involved, calling more often, stopping by more regularly, asking about the house, the properties, the accounts. At first, I received it as care, a son paying attention to his mother. I had been grateful for it, but gradually the questions changed in character. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way a familiar road develops a new crack, you drive over it a dozen times before you actually feel it. "Have you thought about simplifying the properties, Mom? Managing 3 rentals on your own seems like a lot." And then, a few months later, "Have you looked at your investment accounts recently? Markets have been unpredictable." And then, "When did you last update your will? Dad's been gone 4 years now. Things change." Each question taken alone was reasonable. Taken together over time, they began to form something else, a pattern I could feel before I could name. Connor was quieter about it, which was simply his nature. He had always been the son who expressed things sideways, through presence, rather than words, through small actions, rather than direct statements. He started joining Ryan on visits more often than he used to. He would sit across from me at the dining room table, and listened more than he spoke, watching me in a way that felt less like affection and more like assessment. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I was good at telling myself that. Then came their wives. Ryan had been married to Stephanie for 6 years. She was a sharp, composed woman who worked in financial consulting and had the particular kind of confidence that comes from being good at something that most people find intimidating. She dressed carefully, spoke precisely, and had a way of entering a room that made you aware she had already decided how the conversation would go. I had always respected her competence, even when I found her difficult to warm to. Brianna Connor's wife, of 4 years, was different, softer in manner, quicker to laugh, the kind of woman who remembered your coffee order and asked follow-up questions about things you had mentioned weeks before. She had always made an effort with me in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. At family dinners, she was the one who helped clear the table without being asked, who steered conversations toward common ground when the room felt tense. I had always liked her, but lately, something had changed in Brianna too. Not in what she said, but in what she didn't say. A careful silence had settled over her at family gatherings, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but watchful. She would glance at Connor sometimes, when certain topics came up, a quick look that lasted less than a second, then return her eyes to her plate. I noticed it. I filed it away. Stephanie, meanwhile, had begun asking questions of her own. Hers were smoother than Ryan's, wrapped in the language of practicality and concern, delivered with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about how they would land. Have you considered consolidating your accounts, Ellie? It would make everything so much easier to manage in one place. And I'd be happy to look over your financial structure sometime, just as a second set of eyes. It's what I do, after all. And most recently, have you thought about what happens to the properties if something were to happen to you? It's worth having a clear plan. Something were to happen to you. I smiled each time and said I appreciated the thought. I changed the subject with the ease of a woman who had spent 40 years redirecting teenagers mid-sentence. But I listened, and I remembered. What I noticed most in those months was what happened when I gave answers that weren't the ones they were looking for. A brief pause, a recalibration. Ryan would nod slowly and say, "Of course," in a tone that meant the conversation wasn't actually over. Stephanie would smile and say something like, "Just something to think about," with the particular smoothness of a woman who knew how to plant a seed and wait. And then about 3 months ago, I learned something that shifted the picture entirely. My neighbor Carol, a woman in her 70s who had lived 2 houses down for nearly 15 years, the kind of neighbor who notices everything and judges nothing, stopped me one afternoon as I was checking my mail. She mentioned almost in passing that Stephanie had come by to visit her recently. Just to chat, she had said. Asked how I was doing, asked whether I had seemed forgetful lately, whether I ever left my porch light on all night, whether I had mentioned feeling overwhelmed. Carol had answered vaguely, she told me, because something about the questions hadn't felt quite right. I thanked her, walked back inside, and stood in my front hallway for a long moment. That evening, Stephanie called. She asked how I was doing. She mentioned that she had been thinking about my situation and wanted to revisit a conversation we'd had a few weeks earlier about having some paperwork updated. She smiled. I could hear it in her voice, and said we could revisit it later. That word revisit stayed with me longer than anything else. Some things deserve a second reading. That was the thought that pulled me out of bed 2 months ago. Sometime past 11, on a Tuesday night, padding quietly down the hallway in my robe and slippers, to the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept my important papers. The house was dark, except for the lamp on the desk. Outside, the street was quiet, the way Charleston gets in the late hours when even the restaurants have closed and the neighborhood exhales. I opened the bottom drawer and took out the folder Stephanie had brought over 3 weeks earlier. She had arrived on a Sunday afternoon, Ryan beside her, both of them dressed as though they had come from somewhere else. First church, perhaps, or brunch with friends. Stephanie had carried a leather portfolio under her arm with the ease of someone accustomed to presenting things professionally. She had set it on my coffee table with a small, practiced smile. "We've just been doing some thinking," she said, "about making sure everything is in order. For all of us. It's really just a precaution." Ryan had nodded beside her. "It's the responsible thing to do, Mom. Dad would have wanted things organized." I had looked at the portfolio without touching it for a moment. Then I opened it. Inside were several pages of legal documents, printed cleanly on white paper, the language dense, but not impenetrable to someone who had spent 4 decades teaching her students to read carefully. Stephanie had described it simply enough, a standard authorization form, she said. Something to have on file in case of emergency. Medical decisions, financial oversight, the kind of thing families put in place every day. I had read the first page while they watched. Then I had set it down and said I would think about it. What I had not told them was that I had read enough to know I needed to read the rest alone, without an audience, without the particular pressure of 2 people sitting across from me, waiting for a response. Now, in the quiet of the late evening, I read it properly. The first section was straightforward enough, the kind of language that sounds reasonable on the surface, the kind designed to move quickly past your defenses before you realize what it's actually saying. Authorization for medical decision-making in the event of incapacitation. Standard. Expected. I had no particular objection to the idea of having something like that in place under the right circumstances. But I kept reading. The second section was where the language began to shift. The definitions of incapacitation were broader than anything a reasonable person would need. Not limited to unconsciousness or severe medical crisis, but extending to situations involving demonstrated difficulty, managing complex financial affairs, or evidence of impaired judgment as assessed by a qualified professional. Qualified professional. The phrase was not further defined. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I turned to the third section, which outlined financial oversight permissions. This was not a narrow clause. It covered existing accounts, future accounts, property, holdings, investment decisions, and buried in the middle of a long paragraph on page 4, the authority to act on behalf of the signatory in any legal matter pertaining to real estate. Any legal matter pertaining to real estate. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. This was not a precaution. This was not the responsible thing to do. This was a document that, once signed, would have handed Ryan and Stephanie the legal authority to make decisions about my life, my finances, my medical care, my property, under conditions that were deliberately left open to interpretation. I turned to the final page. Most of it was signature lines and dates, the standard architecture of a legal document. But at the very bottom, in smaller print than the rest, was a line I had nearly missed the first time. A firm name, an address in downtown Charleston, and beneath it, in italics, a description of their area of practice. Elder care legal services, guardianship petitions, capacity evaluations. I read those 3 phrases slowly, one at a time. A firm that specialized in removing decision-making authority from older adults had prepared this document. A firm whose entire practice was built around the legal process of determining that someone was no longer fit to manage their own affairs had written the language that Stephanie had placed in front of me on a Sunday afternoon and described as a simple precaution. I closed the folder. I set it on the corner of the desk and turned off the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark, very still, the way I used to sit before a difficult conversation, gathering myself, organizing my thoughts, making sure that when I spoke, I said exactly what I meant. The following morning, I called Stephanie. I told her I had reviewed the documents thoroughly, and I would not be signing them. My voice was calm. My hands were steady. I said it the way I would have said anything that was simply and completely true. There was a pause on the other end of the line, brief but present. Then Stephanie said that she understood and that there was certainly no pressure, and that whenever I felt ready, we could always talk through any concerns I might have. Something about the way she said it made me look up from where I was standing by the kitchen window out at the quiet street beyond the glass. And what I saw in her eyes confirmed everything. The knock came early, just past 7:30 on a Thursday morning, while the coffee was still brewing and the light outside was the pale, tentative kind that hadn't quite decided to be a full day yet. I wasn't expecting anyone. I set down my mug and walked to the front door, and when I opened it, I found my neighbor standing on the porch. Her name was Carol Jennings, and she had lived 2 houses down from me for nearly 15 years. A woman in her early 70s, widowed like me, sharp in the way that people become when life has given them enough to pay attention to. We were not close friends in the way that involves regular dinners or shared vacations, but we were the kind of neighbors who looked out for each other quietly, without making a production of it. She had brought soup when Robert passed. I had helped her navigate a billing dispute with her insurance company the following winter. That was the nature of what we were to each other. Steady, reliable, undemanding. She did not look steady this morning. She looked like a woman who had spent several days deciding whether to say something and had finally concluded that not saying it would be worse. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," she said. "Of course not. Come in." She stepped inside and followed me to the living room, where she sat on the edge of the armchair nearest the door, the posture of someone who wasn't sure how long she intended to stay. I sat across from her and waited. I had learned in 40 years of working with people of all ages that some conversations need a moment of silence before they can begin properly. Carol folded her hands in her lap and looked at me directly. "Your daughter-in-law came to see me," she said. "The older one, Ryan's wife." I kept my expression neutral. "Stephanie." "Yes." Carol paused. "About 3 weeks ago." She said she was just checking in on the neighborhood, making conversation. But the questions she was asking, she stopped, chose her next words carefully. They weren't really about the neighborhood. I waited. "She asked about you," Carol said. "Specifically, whether I had noticed any changes in you lately. Whether you seemed forgetful or confused. Whether you ever left your lights on all night, or your car running in the driveway. Whether you had mentioned feeling overwhelmed by managing things on your own." Carol's jaw tightened slightly. She asked it all very pleasantly, very casually, as though it were perfectly normal to walk up to a neighbor and ask those kinds of questions about someone who lives down the street. The coffee maker beeped from the kitchen. Neither of us moved. "I gave her very little," Carol continued. "Something didn't sit right with me from the start. I said I hadn't noticed anything concerning and changed the subject. She met my eyes. But I want you to know she didn't just come to me." "Who else?" Carol counted quietly on her fingers. "Margaret Patterson across the street. The young couple 2 doors down, the Hendersons. And I believe she also spoke with Frank Alders on the corner, though I'm less certain about that one. 4 neighbors, possibly more." I sat with that for a moment. Not with panic. Panic wasn't useful, and I had never been particularly prone to it, but with the careful, measured attention I gave to anything that deserved to be understood completely before being acted upon. Stephanie had not been asking casual questions. She had been building something, a record assembled quietly and patiently from the observations of people who had no reason to suspect they were being used. People who, if asked later by an attorney or a social worker, might recall that yes, Ryan's wife had mentioned some concerns about the elderly woman on the block. That, yes, there had been questions raised. That, yes, perhaps it was worth looking into. It was methodical, and it had been going on for weeks before I had any idea. "Thank you for telling me," I said. My voice was even. "I mean that sincerely, Carol." She nodded, something loosening slightly in her posture. I wasn't sure if it was my place, but I kept thinking if our situations were reversed, I would want to know. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing consequential. Her daughter's upcoming visit, the oak tree at the end of the block that the city kept promising to trim. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation that helps a difficult one settle into something manageable. Then she stood, said she was glad she had come, and I walked her to the door. I watched her make her way back down the front path, then closed the door quietly and stood alone in my front hallway. The picture had changed again. Not just Ryan and Stephanie inside my home asking questions across my dining room table, but Stephanie outside my home, moving through my neighborhood, speaking to people I had known for years, collecting impressions and storing them away like evidence, because that was exactly what it was, I spent the rest of the day moving through my routines, errands, a phone call with an old colleague, dinner prepared, and eaten at the kitchen table with the radio on low. Ordinary things deliberately done. I had learned long ago that the best response to being watched was simply to keep living as though you weren't. It was just past 7 in the evening when I stepped out onto the front porch to water the potted ferns that lined the railing. The neighborhood was settling into its end-of-day quiet porch lights, beginning to come on up and down the block, the distant sound of a lawnmower finishing its last pass somewhere nearby. That was when I noticed the car, dark midsize, parked along the curb about 4 houses down, close enough to have a clear line of sight to my front door, far enough to seem unremarkable. I would not have given it a second thought, except that I had seen it there yesterday evening as well, and the evening before that. I watered the ferns slowly, deliberately, without looking directly at the car again. Then I went back inside. I stood at the living room window for a moment, watching from behind the curtain. The car didn't move. I didn't know who was in that car, but I knew one thing. This was no coincidence. The next morning, I was up before the sun. I hadn't slept much, but what sleep I had gotten was the clean, purposeful kind, the kind that comes not from peace, but from clarity. My mind had made a decision somewhere in the night, and my body had simply caught up with it by the time the first gray light began showing at the edges of the curtains. I dressed quietly, made coffee, and stood at the front window with my mug in both hands, looking out at the street. The dark car was gone. I had expected that. Whoever had been sitting in it the night before had no reason to stay through the early hours. They had already collected whatever they came to collect. But I had something they didn't know about. I had taken a photograph. I set down my mug, picked up my phone, and looked at the image again. The stretch of curb, the rear of the vehicle, the license plate, slightly blurred, but readable in the way that mattered. Then I opened my contacts and found the name I was looking for. Howard Gallagher had been the family attorney for Robert and me for the better part of 2 decades. He was a quiet, unhurried man who worked out of a modest office in downtown Charleston and had the rare quality of making complicated things feel manageable, without ever pretending they were simple. He had handled our wills, our property, transfers, every significant legal matter we had navigated together as a couple. He had attended Robert's memorial service and shaken my hand afterward with the kind of grip that meant something. He was not a man who was easily rattled, and he was not a man who wasted words. I called him at 8:30 that morning and explained what I needed. He called me back before 2 in the afternoon. The vehicle, he told me, was registered to a small private investigations firm operating out of the north side of the city. One primary operative, 15 years in the field. The name on the record was Marcus Webb. I wrote it down on the notepad I kept beside the telephone and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Can you find out who retained him?" I asked. Howard was quiet for a beat. "I'll make some inquiries," he said. "It may take a day or 2. It took 3. When he called again, his voice carried the particular evenness of a man who had learned something that did not surprise him, but confirmed something he had hoped not to confirm. The arrangement had been made through a legal intermediary, the same firm whose name I had found printed at the bottom of Stephanie's documents weeks earlier. The connection was direct, deliberate, and it had been in place for nearly 6 weeks. I thanked Howard and ended the call. Then I sat at my desk for a long time without moving. 6 weeks. They had been watching me for 6 weeks, documenting my routines, my visitors, my comings and goings, while sitting across from me at family dinners and asking how I was sleeping, while calling to check in, while bringing over the kind of casual concern that looks from the outside indistinguishable from love. I did not call Ryan. I did not call Stephanie. I did not send a message or alter my schedule or do anything at all that might suggest the ground had shifted beneath me, because I understood something clearly. Now, the moment they sensed, I knew they would move faster. And speed was the one advantage I could not afford to hand them. So I kept living as though nothing had changed. Errands on Tuesday. Lunch with a former colleague on Thursday. The garden in the late afternoons, the radio on low during dinner. Ordinary things performed with ordinary care, while something quieter and more purposeful ran steadily beneath the surface. It was on a Tuesday evening, perhaps 2 weeks after Howard's confirmation, that I found myself standing in the upstairs hallway. I was not entirely sure what had drawn me there. I had come upstairs to retrieve a sweater from the bedroom closet, and on my way back, I had stopped, the way you stop sometimes, in a place you have walked past 100 times, when something catches at you without quite announcing itself. At the end of the hallway was a small storage room. The door was slightly ajar, the way it often was. Inside, pushed against the far wall, beneath a shelf of old records and photograph albums, sat Robert's safe. It was not large, a dark gray steel box, perhaps 18 inches square, bolted to the baseboard. A fine layer of dust had settled over it, the way dust settles over things that haven't been touched in a long while. Robert had installed it himself in the early years of the house, back when he had the particular energy of a man making a place his own. After he passed, I had moved the most essential papers to my filing cabinet and had not opened it since. 4 years. I stood in the dim light of the hallway and looked at it through the open door. I am not a woman who puts great stock in signs or symbols. I have lived too practically for that, and Robert had too, in most things. But standing there that evening, something settled over me, not urgency exactly, and not fear, but the particular weight of a thing that has been waiting. His voice came back to me, the way it occasionally did, in quiet moments, unhurried, and certain, the way he had always sounded when he was saying something he needed me to remember. If something ever feels wrong, not wrong, like a hard season, but wrong in the way your whole body knows, before your mind catches up, trust it. Don't talk yourself out of it. Don't let anyone convince you that you're imagining things. I had carried those words with me for weeks. I had turned them over in the small hours of sleepless nights, held them up against everything that had been happening, tested them against what I knew and what I suspected. But standing here in this particular hallway, in front of this particular object, they landed with a weight they hadn't carried before. I crossed the threshold slowly, knelt down on the hardwood floor, reached out and placed my hand against the cold face of the combination lock, feeling the faint resistance of metal that had not been turned in a very long time. Robert had always said, if something feels wrong, trust it. Standing there in the dim hallway, I finally understood what he meant. The combination came back to me without effort. That surprised me somehow, that 4 years of distance hadn't taken it. But the sequence lived in my fingers the way certain things do, when they've been repeated enough times to become part of you. 3 numbers to the right, 2 to the left, 1 back to the right. The lock disengaged with a soft, solid click that seemed very loud in the quiet of that small room. I pulled the door open slowly. The smell reached me first, the particular scent of old paper, an enclosed space, faintly metallic from the steel walls, underlaid with something else I couldn't immediately name. Something that reminded me of the study downstairs in the years when Robert still used it regularly. His presence, preserved by accident in the stillness of a sealed space. I sat back on my heels and simply looked for a moment. There were documents I recognized, property certificates, insurance records, a copy of Robert's medical license in a protective sleeve. Things I had expected to find. Things I had moved the originals of long ago and had forgotten about the duplicates. Ordinary things stacked with the particular neatness of a man who organized everything he touched. And then toward the back, something I had not expected. A folder, dark green, thick with paper, secured with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. On the front, in Robert's handwriting, the careful slanted print he used for things he considered important, were 2 words, just in case. I reached in and took it out. It was heavier than I anticipated. Beneath it, resting flat against the floor of the safe, was a small device, rectangular, no larger than a deck of cards, with a single button on the side and a small speaker grill along the top. A voice recorder, the old-fashioned kind, the sort that had sat in the pocket of Robert's white coat for 20 years, while he dictated patient notes during his rounds. I picked it up carefully, the way you handle something that belonged to someone who is no longer there to handle it themselves. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I pressed play. There was a brief hiss of static, a pause, and then, after 4 years of silence, Robert's voice filled the small room. It was so, precisely, completely him, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Not because it was unexpected exactly, but because nothing prepares you for the sound of a voice you love after a long absence. Not the memory of it, not the anticipation of it, the actual voice with all its familiar weight and cadence, as present and unhurried as it had always been. Ellie, a pause. If you're hearing this, it means you already know, and it means you're already strong enough to handle it. My hand tightened around the recorder. I want to start by saying that I hope you never need this. I mean that. I hope this safe stays shut, and this recording stays unheard, and everything I've put together in that folder never becomes relevant to anything. But I know you, and I know our sons, and I've learned over the course of a long life that the people we love most are sometimes capable of things we never anticipated, not out of cruelty, but out of need, out of fear, out of the particular blindness that comes when people convince themselves that what they want is also what is right. I closed my eyes. I've been watching for a while now, he continued. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't stop noticing things. The questions they asked when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The way certain conversations changed direction when finances came up. Small things individually. But you know what I've always said about small things. I did know. I had heard him say it 100 times in 35 years of marriage. Small things don't stay small. They just stay quiet until they don't. Everything I found is in the folder. I've documented what I could, dates, amounts, conversations. I was present for records I requested and kept copies of. It's not everything, but it's enough. Enough to protect you if it comes to that. Enough to make sure that the life we built together stays yours. His voice shifted slightly, still steady but softer. I want you to know something else. What we had, what we built, in that house, in that city, in 40 years of choosing each other every single morning, that was real. Whatever happens with the boys, whatever shape this takes, don't let it make you doubt that. You were the best decision I ever made, and I would make it again every time, without a moment's hesitation. I was crying by then. Not quietly, the way I sometimes cried when I was alone and allowed myself to, but fully in the way grief moves through you when it finds a door left open. The kind of tears that aren't just about sadness, but about love and time and the strange mercy of being known completely by another person. I sat on the floor of that small room, with Robert's voice recorder pressed against my chest, and I let myself feel all of it. After a while, the feeling settled, not gone, but transformed into something quieter, something I could carry. I thought of a verse my mother had read to me once, when I was young, something about strength being made perfect in weakness, about not being given more than we could bear. I had not been a church-going woman in the strict sense for many years, but I had never stopped believing in something larger than myself, some grace that moves through ordinary lives in ways that aren't always visible until you need them most. Sitting on that floor, I felt it. The particular steadiness that comes not from having all the answers, but from knowing with complete certainty that you are not alone. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I straightened my back. I looked at the folder in my lap, thick, heavy, filled with 4 years of quiet preparation, by a man who had loved me well enough to protect me even after he was gone. I sat there for a long time after his voice faded. Then I wiped my eyes, straightened my back, and opened the folder. Robert had prepared everything. Now it was my turn. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning, tucked between a utility bill and a piece of unsolicited mail. Standard bank correspondence, white unremarkable. I opened it at the kitchen counter while the kettle heated. It was not routine. The document inside was a transfer authorization form, a request to move a significant portion of funds from my primary account into a secondary account I did not recognize. The form had been processed 3 weeks prior, and at the bottom of the page on the line designated for the account holder's signature was my name. I set the kettle down. I carried the document to the desk, where the morning light came through at an angle that made reading easier, and I looked at the signature for a long time. It was a reasonable imitation. Someone had studied my handwriting carefully, the particular way I formed the capital E, the slight leftward lean of my letters. From a distance, it might have passed without question. But I had been reading and writing for 67 years. I knew my own hand, and this was not it. I called Howard within the hour. By the following morning, he had arranged for a document specialist, a retired forensic examiner he trusted to review the signature against authenticated samples of my actual handwriting. The examiner spent 40 minutes with the materials. When he emerged, he didn't need more than 2 sentences. This was not written by the same person. The structural patterns are inconsistent in ways that don't appear under normal variation. Howard looked at me across his desk when the examiner had gone. "Ellie," he said carefully, "you understand what this means?" "Yes," I said, "I do." It meant someone had taken a sample of my signature from something I had signed without thinking and used it to authorize a financial transaction without my knowledge. It meant this had moved beyond family conflict into territory with real legal consequences, the kind that involved formal proceedings and decisions that once made could not easily be undone. "What would you like to do?" Howard asked. I looked out the window. A woman was walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk, moving at the unhurried pace of someone with nowhere particular to be. Ordinary life, indifferent to the weight of the room I was sitting in. I thought about Ryan as a boy, 7 years old, at the kitchen table, asking me to quiz him on spelling words he already knew because he liked the praise. I thought about the document on Howard's desk and the name written on it that wasn't mine. "Let me think about it overnight," I said. I drove home in the late afternoon with that decision sitting quietly beside me. I had not resolved it by the time I pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. I went inside, made dinner, ate without tasting much. It was just past 7 when the knock came. I opened the door to find a man I had never met face to face, though I recognized him immediately. Medium height, mid-40s, with the careful stillness of someone who had spent years watching others without being watched. He was holding nothing in his hands. His expression carried something I had not expected. Discomfort, the specific kind that belongs to a person who has come to say something difficult because staying silent has become impossible. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "my name is Marcus Webb. I believe you already know who I am." I stepped back. "Come in." He sat on the edge of the couch, the posture of someone uncertain of their welcome. I sat across from him and waited. He didn't take long. He told me he had been retained 6 weeks earlier to document behavioral patterns that might support concerns about my ability to manage my own affairs. He told me that what he had observed over those 6 weeks had not matched what he had been hired to find. He told me that 2 weeks into the work, he had been positioned outside the window of a private meeting between his client, the client's brother, and both of their wives, and that what he heard had changed his understanding of what he was participating in. He reached into his jacket and placed a small device on the coffee table between us. "A USB drive, no larger than my thumb. Everything is on there," he said. "The dates, the meeting, all of it." A pause. "I kept copies for my own records. I'm not asking for anything in return." He stopped. Then, "I've done a lot of work in this field I'm not proud of, but this one I needed to get right." I looked at the drive, then at him. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once, stood, and walked to the door, without the usual glance around a room that people give when they're leaving somewhere for the first time. A man who had made his decision and was done with second-guessing it. He left without looking back. I closed the door and stood in the silence. Somehow I knew this wasn't over yet. 5 days ago, the morning came in the way October mornings do in Charleston. Cool and unhurried, the air carrying that particular clarity that arrives After a night of rain, when everything smells faintly of wet leaves and the sky has the clean, washed quality of something newly made. I had been sleeping better than I expected. Not easily, exactly, but solidly the way you sleep, when your body understands that rest is necessary for what comes next. I made coffee, pulled on a cardigan, and walked out the front door just before 7 to retrieve the morning paper and check the mail. The paper was there. The usual assortment of envelopes was there. And at the back of the small stack, pressed against the inside wall of the mailbox as though it had been placed there deliberately, rather than delivered, was something that stopped me where I stood. A plain, white envelope, no return address, no postage mark, no printed label, just my name, written by hand, in the center of the front, careful, unhurried letters that I recognized before I had consciously decided to recognize them. I stood on the front path for a moment, with the envelope in my hand and the rest of the mail pressed against my side, looking at those letters. The handwriting was familiar, in the particular way of something you have seen only occasionally, but paid attention to a birthday card 2 years ago. A note tucked into a dish, brought to a family gathering, small domestic gestures that I had filed away without knowing I was filing them. Connor's wife, Brianna, had always been the quieter of the 2 women who had married into my family. She was warm where Stephanie was polished, genuine where Stephanie was precise. She had made efforts with me over the years that felt like real efforts rather than performances, remembering things I mentioned, asking questions that showed she had been listening. At family gatherings in recent months, I had noticed her withdrawal into a careful silence, the quick glances she exchanged with Connor when certain topics arose, the way she seemed to carry something heavy without letting it show. I had noticed. I had said nothing. I had waited. I went back inside, set the rest of the mail on the counter, and carried the envelope to the kitchen table. I sat down with it in front of me and did not open it immediately. Instead, I closed my eyes. I am not a woman who prays loudly or often. My faith has always been a quiet thing, personal and private. More conversation than ceremony. The kind that doesn't require a particular building or a particular hour, but simply the willingness to be still and honest. I had prayed in the weeks since all of this began, in small moments between one task and the next, asking not for specific outcomes, but for the clarity to see what was true and the strength to act on it without fear. I prayed now, briefly, sincerely, the way you speak to someone you trust completely. I thanked God for the people who had found the courage to do right by me, for Carol, who had walked down the street when it would have been easier not to, for the man who had placed a small drive on my coffee table and asked for nothing in return. And I asked simply for the wisdom to receive whatever was in this envelope with the steadiness it deserved. Then I opened it. Inside were 4 pages folded together, printed documents, the text dense and specific, in the way of something that had been written for internal reference rather than outside eyes. At the top of the first page, underlined twice in pen, were the words timeline and action steps. I read slowly and carefully, the way I had always read anything that mattered. What was laid out across those 4 pages was a plan, not a vague one, a specific sequence plan with dates and contingencies, and language that had clearly been borrowed from legal research. It documented the steps that had been taken over the preceding months and the steps that were still intended. The neighbor interviews, the surveillance arrangement, the paperwork. The next stage, outlined with a clarity that was almost clinical, involved initiating a formal capacity evaluation through the elder care firm, whose name I had found at the bottom of Stephanie's documents, timed according to the notes on the final page for the end of the month. 12 days from now. I set the pages down on the table and pressed my hands flat against them for a moment, feeling the slight texture of the paper beneath my palms. In the margin of the last page, written in the same careful hand as my name on the envelope, were 4 words that had no connection to the typed text around them. 4 words that appeared to have been added after everything else was already written, as though someone had held the page for a long time before finally pressing pen to paper. "I'm sorry. Forgive me." I sat with those 4 words for a long time. Brianna had known. She had known for longer than any of this had been visible to me, and she had carried it in that particular silence. I had noticed at family dinners the silence of a person who is not indifferent, but trapped, caught between what she knew was right and what she feared the cost of doing right would be. She had not come forward easily, but she had come forward. I folded the pages back into the envelope and held it in both hands. 4 pages of evidence, 4 words of apology. And now, for the first time, since all of this began, a complete picture. I was no longer operating on instinct and fragments. I was no longer waiting for the next revelation, the next knock at the door, the next thing I hadn't anticipated. I had Robert's folder. I had the recording. I had the documents. Brianna had risked something real to send me. For the first time, since all of this began, I wasn't the one being watched. I was the one who could see everything. Not frantically, not emotionally, the way you lay out the pieces of something complicated before you begin to work with it deliberately, with space between each item so that the whole picture has room to breathe. Robert's folder on the left, the transfer document with the signature that wasn't mine beside it, the USB drive Marcus had placed on my coffee table, and on the right, Brianna's envelope, the 4 typed pages refolded neatly inside it. 4 separate threads gathered over the course of weeks from 4 separate sources, each one telling a piece of a story that only made complete sense when they were laid out together like this. I stood at the head of the table and looked at all of it for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Howard. He arrived at his office. Before I did, I had learned over 20 years that Howard was always early, that he considered punctuality a form of respect rather than a courtesy. When I walked in and set my bag on the chair across from his desk, he looked at my face and said nothing. He simply waited. That was another thing I had always valued in him. I placed each item on his desk, one at a time, in the order I had assembled them, and I walked him through everything. I did not rush. I did not editorialize. I presented the information the way I had always taught my students to present an argument, with evidence first, interpretation after, and conclusions drawn only from what could be demonstrated. Howard listened without interrupting. He examined each document as I handed it to him, turning pages with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that what he was reading mattered. When I finished, he set the last item down and sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. Then he said Robert was thorough. I agreed. Howard leaned forward and folded his hands on the desk. "All right," he said. "Let me tell you what we're working with." He went through it methodically, the way he approached everything, layer by layer, from the most straightforward to the most complex. The folder Robert had compiled provided a documented pattern of behavior, stretching back years, assembled by someone with both the knowledge and the foresight to understand what it might one day be needed for. The transfer document represented a serious legal matter, the kind that, if pursued, carried significant consequences for whoever had arranged it. The recording on the USB, depending on its contents, could be among the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire picture. And Brianna's documents provided something that the other pieces, strong as they were, could not provide on their own. Timing, intent, a written record of exactly what had been planned and when. Together, Howard said, "This is not a family dispute. This is a documented pattern of coordinated action designed to remove your legal autonomy." He paused. "And the people responsible for it did not anticipate that you would have any of this." "No," I said. "They didn't." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the items on his desk. Then he began outlining what he believed the appropriate response to be, not punitive, not reactive, but structural. Steps that would close every door they had been counting on finding open. Legal protections that would make any future attempt not merely difficult, but impossible. A meeting formal and documented, where everything would be placed on the table in a setting that left no room for reinterpretation. I listened carefully, asking questions where I needed to, taking notes in the small notebook I had brought with me. By the time we were finished, the afternoon light had shifted across the office floor, and the street outside had grown quieter with the approach of evening. Howard gathered the documents into a neat stack and looked at me with the directness he reserved for moments that required it. "How far do you want to take this?" he asked. The question sat between us for a moment, not awkward, but weighted. Because it was the real question, the one beneath all the legal strategy and careful documentation. It was asking not what I could do, but what I was willing to do. How much of what had happened I intended to answer, and in what terms. I thought about Ryan at 7, and about the man he had become. I thought about Connor's silence and Brianna's 4 words in the margin. I thought about Stephanie's careful smile and the folder my husband had assembled in the years before he left this world, and the recording of his voice telling me I was already strong enough. I looked straight into Howard's eyes, and I answered. That evening, I drove home through streets that felt different than they had a week ago. Not the city that had changed, but something in the way I moved through it. I made a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, and when the dishes were done, I turned off the lights in the kitchen and the living room and carried a glass of water upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed, Robert's side and mine, both of them mine now, and in the quiet of the room, I prayed. Not for a particular outcome, not for protection from what was coming, because I no longer needed protection from it. I prayed with gratitude for Robert's foresight, for Carol's honesty, for Marcus's conscience, for Brianna's courage, for the particular grace that had moved through each of them at the moment when it was needed. I thanked God for the clarity that had carried me through the weeks since a Wednesday evening, when everything had changed at my own kitchen table. And then I said amen, set my glass on the nightstand, and lay down in the dark. Friday was 3 days away. I was ready. Friday arrived the way important days often do, quietly, without ceremony, looking from the outside like any other morning. The sky over Charleston was the pale, even gray of early November, the kind that softens the light without darkening it, that makes everything look slightly more deliberate than usual. I had been awake since 5:30, not from anxiety. I had moved past anxiety some time ago, but from the simple fact that my body understood this was not a morning for sleeping late. I dressed carefully. I made coffee and drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the street come alive in the slow, unhurried way of a neighborhood that didn't know anything significant was about to happen. I arrived at Howard's office 20 minutes early. The conference room was on the second floor, a long rectangular space with a table that seated 8 tall windows overlooking the street and the particular stillness of a room that had held a great many difficult conversations and absorbed all of them without comment. Howard had arranged 4 chairs on one side of the table and 2 on the other, a water pitcher and glasses in the center, nothing else. I chose my seat not at the head of the table, not at the far end, but centered on the 2-chair side facing the door. Howard sat beside me, a closed folder in front of him, his hands resting quietly on the table. We did not speak much. There was nothing left to plan that hadn't already been planned. We waited. They arrived 7 minutes after the hour Ryan first, which I had expected. He was the kind of man who believed that entering a room first gave him an advantage, and he had believed it since he was old enough to understand what advantages were. He was dressed well, as he always was, the careful presentation of a man who understood the weight of appearances. He looked at me when he came through the door, and something moved across his face that he controlled almost immediately. Almost. Connor followed 2 steps behind, the way he had followed Ryan for most of their lives. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something too heavy for too long. His eyes found mine briefly, then moved away. Stephanie came in behind them, leather portfolio under her arm, expression composed with the precision of someone who had prepared for this, the way you prepare for a professional presentation. She assessed the room in a single, practiced glance, the seating arrangement, Howard's folder, my posture, and sat down across from me without speaking, and then last through the door moving quietly to the chair at the far end of the row, Brianna. She did not look like the others. She was not composed. She was not performing composure. She sat down in the corner chair and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the table in front of her with the expression of someone who had made a decision she knew was right and was prepared to live with everything it cost her. She did not look at Connor. Connor did not look at her. I noticed all of it. I said nothing. Ryan settled into his chair and looked across the table at me with the measured ease of a man who still believed he understood the terrain. "Mom," he said. His voice was warm, practiced. "I think we can handle this without making it more formal than it needs to be." Howard spoke before I did. "The formality," he said evenly, "is appropriate given the nature of what we're here to discuss." He opened his folder. "I'd like to begin by establishing a few points of fact." Ryan's jaw tightened slightly. Stephanie's posture shifted barely perceptible. But there, she was recalibrating. I recognized it from weeks of watching her do it across dining room tables and in phone conversations. The rapid, practiced adjustment of a person who needed to remain in control of every room she entered. She would not be in control of this one. Howard proceeded methodically, the way he did everything. He outlined the timeline of events, not with accusation, but with documentation, dates, actions, a sequence that had been assembled carefully and could be corroborated at every point. He spoke in the measured tone of a man who had said difficult things in professional settings for 30 years and had learned that clarity was more effective than emphasis. Ryan interrupted twice. Howard acknowledged both interruptions politely and continued. Connor said nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes directed somewhere between the water pitcher and the far wall, the stillness of a man who had run out of ways to avoid the moment he was sitting in. Stephanie's composure held. I gave her credit for that. But her eyes were moving now, tracking Howard's folder, calculating, looking for the angle that wasn't there. When Howard finished the timeline, he paused. The room was very quiet. I reached into the bag beside my chair and placed a small device on the table in front of me, a USB drive. I set it down without comment, without explanation, without looking at anyone in particular, just placed it there in the center of the table, in the silence, and left it. Ryan's eyes went to it immediately, then to me, then back to it. He opened his mouth to speak. I raised one hand just slightly and he stopped, because for the first time, he understood. He was no longer in control of what happened next. Howard reached across the table and connected the drive to his laptop. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint click of the connection, and then the brief pause of a device being recognized, and then voices. Ryan's voice came first, clear and unhurried, with the particular confidence of a man who believed he was in a private space. Then, Stephanie's lower and more precise. Then Connor's quieter than the others. Occasional the voice of someone present, but not leading. The recording had been made in an interior space. There was the faint, ambient quality of a closed room. The subtle acoustics of walls and furniture absorbing sound. The words themselves were not ambiguous. They did not require interpretation. They were specific, sequenced, and spoken by people who believed they were not being heard. I did not look at Ryan while the recording played. I looked at the table in front of me, my hands folded quietly in my lap, and I listened to my own family discuss the management of my life as though I were not a person in it, but a circumstance to be administered. Across the table, Stephanie went very still. Ryan's expression changed in the way that expressions change when a person realizes in real time that the ground they were standing on no longer exists. Not dramatically, there was no outburst, no sudden movement, just a gradual, visible recalibration, the slow adjustment of a face that had spent years presenting one thing while concealing another, now confronted with the end of that particular performance. Connor looked at the table. He had looked at the table for most of the morning. But now his stillness was different, heavier, more final, the stillness of a man who had arrived somewhere. He could not leave the same way he had entered. Howard stopped the recording when he had played enough. The room was quiet again, but it was a different quiet than before. Not the taut, suspended quiet of something waiting to happen, but the flat, settled quiet of something that already had. Howard opened his folder. He placed the transfer document on the table. First, the one with the signature that was not mine, reviewed and confirmed by a forensic documents examiner, whose credentials and findings were attached in a separate page. He set it down without comment and gave the room a moment to absorb it. Ryan looked at it. Something moved through his face that he did not bother to control this time. Stephanie's composure, which had held through the recording with a discipline I recognized as genuine effort, developed a crack so small it would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. I was watching for it. I saw it. Howard placed the second item on the table. Robert's folder, not the original, which I had kept safely at home, but a detailed summary document he had prepared, itemizing the contents, the dates, the pattern of behavior Robert had documented across the final years of his life. Evidence assembled by a cardiologist who had spent 3 decades learning to read the signs of things going wrong before they became irreversible. This documentation, Howard said, was prepared by Eleanor's late husband over a period of several years prior to his passing. It establishes a documented history of behavior relevant to the current situation. The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Connor's head came up slowly. He looked at the summary document in a way that suggested he was reading it, but not fully processing what he was reading, the expression of a person whose understanding of events was being revised in real time in ways that were not comfortable. Howard continued. He outlined the legal protections that had been established, not punitive measures, not actions taken against anyone, but structural safeguards that had been quietly put in place. Accounts restructured, documentation filed, protections that ensured any future attempt to challenge Eleanor Whitmore's legal autonomy would encounter a barrier specifically designed to withstand it. Stephanie set her portfolio on the table in front of her. She did not open it. It sat there like something she had brought to a conversation that had turned out not to need it. "There is one additional item," Howard said. He did not place anything on the table. He simply described the contents of Brianna's envelope, the typed pages, the timeline, the action steps with the same, even documented precision he had brought to everything else. He did not name the source. He did not need to. Connor went completely still, in the way that certain moments make a room contract around the people inside it. This one did. I felt it, the sudden particular quality of a silence that has become about something more than legal proceedings. And then Connor turned his head, slowly, the way you turn towards something you already know is there, but have been hoping until this last possible moment might not be. He looked at Brianna. She was already looking at him. She had not looked away from him since Howard had mentioned the envelope. Her expression was not apologetic, not defiant. It was simply honest in the way that honesty looks when it has finally stopped costing too much to show. Connor held her gaze for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he looked back at the table. Nothing was said. Not a word passed between them in that room. But something had been communicated that was more complete and more irreversible than anything that had been spoken all morning. A question asked and answered without language. A marriage changed in the space of a single look. Ryan pushed back his chair. He stood up with the controlled deliberateness of a man who needed to leave a room, but was determined to do it without the appearance of retreat. He buttoned the front of his jacket, a small, habitual gesture that struck me in that moment as unbearably sad. Then he turned and walked to the door without speaking. Stephanie gathered her portfolio and followed. She did not look at me as she passed. Connor sat for another moment. Just a moment. Then he stood without looking at Brianna, without looking at me, and walked out after his brother. The door closed behind them. Brianna remained in her chair at the end of the table, her hands still folded in her lap, her eyes now directed at the middle distance, with the expression of someone coming to the end of a very long and very difficult road. The room was silent, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, so was everything else. Howard had stepped out quietly, the way good attorneys do when they sense the moment no longer belongs to the law. That left 2 of us in the conference room. Brianna Whitmore sat 3 chairs down from me, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the long mahogany table, as though she were reading something written there that no one else could see. The late afternoon light had shifted while we weren't paying attention. What had been a sharp, clear morning was now something softer, the kind of light that arrives without asking permission, settling over Charleston like a second thought. I didn't move toward her right away. There are moments in life when words are the least useful thing available to you. I had spent 40 years as an English teacher, believing in the power of language. The right sentence at the right time could open a window in someone's chest, could let in air they hadn't known they needed. But sitting in that room with Brianna, I understood something my years in the classroom hadn't fully taught me. Sometimes the kindest thing you can offer another person is simply the space to exist without being asked to explain themselves. So I waited. The clock on the wall marked the seconds. A car passed on the street below. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. It was Brianna who looked up first. Her eyes found mine across the long stretch of table between us. And I saw it then. Not guilt, not fear, but something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. She had been carrying something for a long time. You could see it in the way she held her shoulders, the faint tension around her jaw, the way she breathed a little too carefully, as if she'd spent months measuring out each breath so that nothing spilled over. I thought about everything she must have witnessed in that house, the conversations she must have overheard, the documents. She must have seen the moments. She must have sat at her own kitchen table, knowing what was happening, and understanding that every road forward came with a cost she wasn't certain she could afford. I didn't ask her about any of it. I simply said thank you. 2 words. I meant every syllable of both of them. Something broke open in her face. Not dramatically. Brianna wasn't a dramatic woman, and I had understood that about her. From the first time I'd watched her sit quietly at the edge of a family dinner, observing more than she participated. But her eyes filled, and then the tears came slow and steady, the way rain begins on a Charleston afternoon. Not a sudden storm, just a quiet arrival of something that had been building for a long time. She pressed her lips together, trying to hold it. Then she stopped trying. I should have said something sooner, she whispered. Her voice was unsteady, in a way that told me she had rehearsed those words, not because she was performing them, but because she had said them to herself so many times in private that they had worn grooves in her. She had been apologizing to me in her own mind long before she ever sat in this room. I let the words settle. Then I said the only true thing I knew how to say. You said it when it mattered most. I watched her absorb that. She blinked. Her breath came out in something between a sigh and a sob, and she pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth, a gesture that reminded me suddenly and sharply of someone trying to keep something precious from escaping. We didn't say everything that afternoon. We didn't need to. She told me in pieces that she had first seen the documents 8 months ago, that she had asked Connor what they meant, that his answer, careful, measured, designed to reassure, had not reassured her at all, that she had spent those months trying to find a way forward that didn't require her to choose between her marriage and her conscience, and had eventually understood that some choices make themselves regardless of whether you are ready for them. I listened to all of it. I did not offer her absolution that was not mine to give. I did not minimize what the past 8 months must have cost her. And I did not tell her that everything would be simple from here. Life, in my experience, has very little interest in becoming simple. But I reached across the peel and covered her hand with mine, and I held it there for a moment. And that seemed to be enough. We stayed in that room until the light outside turned the particular shade of amber that belongs only to late Friday afternoons in October, the color of old photographs, of things that have survived long enough to become beautiful. When Brianna finally gathered her things and stood, she paused at the door. She looked back at me once. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. Some things have already been said. Some things don't require saying. I walked to the window after she left and watched her make her way to her car in the parking lot below. She moved carefully, deliberately, A woman who had just set down something heavy and was still adjusting to the unfamiliar lightness of her own hands. Her car pulled out onto the street and moved south toward the part of Charleston where the live oaks line both sides of the road and the late sun turns everything gold for exactly 20 minutes before it disappears. I watched until she was gone. I stood at that window for a long time after thinking about courage, how it rarely looks the way we expect, how we imagine it as something loud and sudden, a decision made in a single bright moment of clarity. But most courage, in my experience, is quieter than that. Sometimes it looks like a plain envelope in a mailbox. I had been home for less than an hour when the knock came. It was different from the others. Not the brisk, purposeful rap of someone who wanted something, but slower, heavier, the kind of knock that carries its own apology inside it. I knew it was Ryan before I opened the door. 41 years of knowing someone's rhythm teaches you things that are almost impossible to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. I crossed the hallway and opened the door. He was standing alone on the front porch in the October dark, his jacket collar turned up against the evening chill. No Stephanie, no Connor, no briefcase, no folder, no careful arrangement of words prepared in advance. Just Ryan, looking for the first time in longer than I could name, like the person he actually was beneath everything he had constructed around himself. He looked tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped back from the door without a word. He entered slowly, the way people do when they're not sure they deserve the space they're being offered. He stood in the entryway for a moment and looked around the house, not the quick assessing glance of someone cataloging assets, but something slower and more searching, the look of a man seeing a place for what it genuinely is, perhaps for the first time in a long while. He looked at the photographs on the wall by the stairs, the one of him and Connor as boys, ages 8 and 5, standing in front of a sandcastle they'd built at Folly Beach, the one of Robert and me at our 25th anniversary dinner, laughing at something neither of us could have remembered afterward, the one of Ryan himself at his college graduation, his gown slightly crooked, grinning with his whole face in a way that he hadn't quite managed since. He looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know where to start." "Then don't start anywhere in particular," I said. "Just say what's true." He moved to the living room and stood near the armchair, Robert's armchair, the one I had never rearranged, but he didn't sit. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and he talked. He talked about the financial trouble that had accumulated over the past 3 years. Not in vague terms, but with the specific, painful honesty of a man who has finally stopped managing how things sound and started saying how they actually are. A business venture that had failed, a second one that had compounded the damage, obligations he hadn't been able to meet, and the particular kind of shame that follows a man home every evening and sits with him through the night. He talked about how Stephanie had found out, about how she had absorbed the information with a quiet, methodical calm that had both reassured him and somewhere underneath frightened him, about how the plan had begun as something that sounded, when framed in the right language, almost reasonable, a restructuring of family assets, a temporary measure, a practical arrangement that would correct itself over time. He paused. "I told myself it was just math," he said. "I told myself you had more than you needed, and we needed more than we had, and that it would balance out eventually." He looked down at his shoes. "I told myself a lot of things." I didn't speak. I had spent my career teaching students that the most important moments in a conversation are the ones where you don't fill the silence. I applied that now. Ryan lifted his eyes to mine, and for the first time, the genuine first time, not a performance, not a strategic glance, he looked directly at me. Not past me, not at the space beside my shoulder, not at some middle distance where difficult things can be faced without quite being confronted, directly at me. His mother. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, same as the ones I had offered Brianna that afternoon. But these arrived differently, heavier, rougher around the edges, carrying the specific weight of a wrong that had been committed rather than witnessed. He wasn't finished. "I stopped seeing you as my mother," he said. His voice had the careful, deliberate quality of someone saying something they have been afraid to say, because saying it makes it undeniably real. "I started seeing you as a solution." The sentence landed in the room between us and stayed there. I had known, on some level, that this was the truth of it. I had understood it, abstractly, the way you can understand a thing before you are ready to feel it. But hearing it spoken aloud, in my own living room, by my oldest son, that was different. That was the truth, arriving in its full weight, without the insulation of distance or deduction. "I know," I said. "That's what hurt the most. Not the documents, not the forged signature, not the network of neighbors being quietly assembled. All of those things had frightened me and angered me and set me into motion. But the fundamental injury, the one that sat beneath all the others, was this, that somewhere along the way, Ryan had stopped looking at me and seeing me." He nodded slowly. There was nothing else to say to that, and he seemed to understand it. He straightened his jacket, the same deliberate gesture I had noticed that morning, but quieter now, smaller, and he moved toward the door. He didn't look back. The door closed behind him with the softest possible sound, as though even the house understood that some departures deserve a kind of gentleness. I stayed where I was for a long time. I sat in the chair beside the window, not Robert's, my own, and I listened to the neighborhood settle into the late evening. A dog somewhere down the street, the distant sound of a television through someone's open window, the ordinary unhurried sounds of a Friday night in Charleston. And I thought about the boy in the photograph on the stairs, 8 years old, wet sand on his knees, grinning at his mother like she was the whole world. I thought about the man who had just walked out my door. I thought about the distance between those two people, and whether it was crossable, and who would have to do the crossing. I knew the answer to that last question, and I knew sitting there in the quiet that it was no longer an answer I could give him. Whether he chose to become the man he still could be, that was his, entirely and only his. I sat there thinking about the boy he used to be, and the man he would have to become now. Whether he chose to or not was no longer something I could decide for him. There is a particular kind of morning that belongs only to new beginnings, not the dramatic kind, not the mornings that arrive with the sharp clarity of a decision just made or a battle just won. Those mornings have their own quality, clean and electric, and I had known a few of them recently. But this was different. This was the quieter kind of new beginning, the sort that doesn't announce itself, that simply shows up one Tuesday in November with a pale sky and the smell of coffee and the soft scrape of folding chairs being set out on a linoleum floor. Pat Coleman arrived at the Charleston Community Center before I did. This did not surprise me. Patricia Coleman had been arriving early to things for as long as I had known her, which was going on 22 years. Since the afternoon, she'd knocked on my door to introduce herself as the new neighbor and ended up staying for dinner. She was 66, a retired nurse who had spent 3 decades at the Medical University of South Carolina, and she moved through the world with the particular calm efficiency of someone who had learned in operating rooms and recovery wards that panic wastes time and preparation saves it. When I pushed open the door to room 14B, she was already unfolding the last of 12 chairs into a rough semicircle. A cup of coffee balanced on the windowsill behind her. "You're late," she said, without turning around. "I'm 4 minutes early," I said. "That's what late looks like when you're the one who called the meeting." She straightened the final chair and finally turned to face me, and the expression on her face was the one I had come to think of over 2 decades as her real face, the one she didn't bother to rearrange for anyone. Warm, direct, and completely unimpressed by excuses. I set my bag down on the table at the front of the room and looked around. It wasn't much. Room 14B at the Charleston Community Center was a modest space, pale green walls that had been repainted at least twice without anyone choosing a different color. 4 windows overlooking the parking lot, a whiteboard that still had the ghost of last week's scheduling notes on it, no matter how many times it was erased. The kind of room that had hosted potlucks and civic meetings and English as a second language classes and grief support groups and probably every other variety of human gathering that doesn't require a stage. It was, in other words, exactly right. I started with the table, spreading out the materials I had spent the previous 2 weeks putting together. Single-page guides on reviewing financial documents, on what a power of attorney actually authorizes, on the questions every woman should be able to answer about her own accounts. Nothing complicated, nothing that required a law degree to understand. The kind of information that should have been handed to every woman at 50, and somehow, in most cases, never was. Pat picked up one of the pages and read it with the focused attention she gave everything. "This is good," she said. "It's a start. It's better than a start." She set the page back down. "You know, I've been thinking about this since you first told me the idea. All those years of women I saw come through the hospital, smart women, careful women, women who had run households and raised children and managed more complexity in a single week than most people manage in a month. And half of them had no idea what was in their own financial documents. No idea at all." She paused. "Nobody ever thought to tell them it mattered. That's why we're here," I said. Pat helped me tape a simple sign to the door, "Financial Foundations, a free workshop for women." And we stood back and looked at it together for a moment. It wasn't fancy. It was printed on plain white paper in a font I had chosen because it was clear and readable, not because it was beautiful. But there it was. We worked through the rest of the preparation in the easy, comfortable rhythm of two people who have known each other long enough to collaborate without narrating everything they're doing. Pat arranged the chairs by a degree or two, the way nurses adjust things by instinct. I tested the whiteboard markers and found that 3 of the 4 were almost dry and made a note to bring replacements. We taped the single-page guides in small stacks on each chair. At some point, Pat made a second cup of coffee and handed one to me, without asking, because she already knew the answer. We stood near the window for a moment, looking out at the parking lot below. A woman in a yellow coat was walking a small dog along the sidewalk. 2 men were loading something into a truck. The ordinary business of a Tuesday morning in November, proceeding without any awareness of what was happening in room 14B. "How many do you think will come?" Pat asked. "I honestly don't know," I said. "I put up notices at the library and the senior center. I told a few people. Word moves the way it moves." "It'll be enough," she said. Not as a reassurance, as a statement of fact, the way Pat said most things. I walked back to the front of the room and stood behind the small table. I looked at the semicircle of empty chairs. The morning light was coming through the windows at a low angle now, the way November light does, casting long pale rectangles across the linoleum. Pat appeared at my shoulder. "Are you ready?" she asked. I looked at the empty room, the chairs, the pages, the sign on the door, the pale light on the floor. And for the first time in a very long time, I was. They started arriving at 9:53. I know the exact time because I had been watching the clock with the particular attention of someone who is trying very hard not to watch the clock. And 9:53 was the moment the door to room 14B opened for the first time. And a woman in a burgundy cardigan stepped carefully inside, looked around and said, "Is this the financial workshop?" "It is," I said. "Come on in." Her name was Dorothy. She was 71, recently widowed, and she had seen the notice at the library 3 weeks ago and almost talked herself out of coming 4 separate times. She told me all of this within the first 2 minutes of sitting down the way people do when they've been holding something quietly, and the simple act of walking through a door releases it. Dorothy was followed by Sandra, 63, a retired postal worker from West Ashley, who had driven 20 minutes and circled the parking lot twice before committing. Then 2 women who arrived together, sisters from the look of them, somewhere in their late 50s, who introduced themselves as June and May and sat down side by side with the coordinated ease of people who had been doing everything together for decades. Then Margaret Patterson walked in. I recognized her immediately. Gray coat, silver hair, pulled back neatly. The careful posture of a woman who had once been told to stand up straight and had never stopped. She was one of the neighbors Stephanie had approached, one of the names Carol had mentioned when she'd stood in my doorway 7 weeks ago with worry in her eyes. Margaret didn't seem to recognize me, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. She simply found a seat in the middle of the semicircle, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the front of the room with the attentive expression of a woman who had decided she was here to learn something and intended to do exactly that. By 11:10, women were seated. I stood at the front of the room, looked out at them, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not nervousness. I had stood in front of classrooms for 40 years, and that particular variety of fear had long since become something else, something closer to electricity. What I felt in that moment was more like recognition. These were women who had navigated long lives with skill and intelligence and care, and somewhere along the way, in the daily business of living, a specific kind of knowledge had not found its way to them. I introduced myself simply. Former English teacher, Charleston resident, for most of my adult life, someone who had recently learned the hard way why understanding your own financial documents is not optional. I did not tell them anything more than that. I didn't need to. I had barely finished the introduction when a woman in the third chair raised her hand. She was 68, heavyset, with reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had not driven here to be polite. Her name, she said, was Gloria, and then she said something I hadn't anticipated. I have a question before we start. How do you know if someone's been taking money from you without you realizing it? The room went very quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, a listening quiet. The kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously recognizes that someone has just said the thing they all came here afraid to ask. I answered her question carefully, specifically, without softening it. I told her what to look for, who to call, what documents to request. I watched her write it down with focused, steady hands. Then from the far end of the semicircle, a woman stood up. She was perhaps 65, in a yellow blouse that had been ironed with precision, and she had been so still in her chair since arriving that I had almost forgotten she was there. She stood without apparent nervousness, looked around the semicircle at the other women, and then looked at me. "I want to say something," she said. "I almost didn't come today. I've been dealing with something with my son and his wife for about a year now. And I didn't tell anyone, because I thought I was the only one." The room held its breath. "I thought it was just me," she said. "I thought maybe I was imagining it, or making too much of it, or that there was something wrong with me, for even thinking my own family could." She stopped, pressed her lips together, continued. "I thought I was the only one." I looked at her across the semicircle of chairs. "You never were," I said. Something shifted in the room then. I had spent enough years in classrooms to know the difference between a room that is being polite and a room that has genuinely opened, and this room opened. Slowly at first, then with the particular momentum of things that have been waiting a long time to move. June spoke, then Sandra, then a woman whose name I hadn't caught yet, who had been sitting near the window with her arms crossed and her expression neutral, and who now leaned forward and said, "My situation was different, but," and didn't stop talking for 4 minutes. Margaret Patterson, in the middle of the semicircle, didn't speak, but somewhere in the second half of the hour, I noticed she had uncrossed her arms. Near the end of the session, I glanced toward the corner of the room. Pat was standing exactly where she had been all morning, her coffee long since finished, her notepad unopened. She was watching the room with an expression I had only seen on her face a handful of times in 22 years. Her eyes were bright and wet at the edges, the way a person's eyes look when they are trying to stay professional, and the room is making it difficult. She caught me looking. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I turned back to the semicircle of women who were still talking to each other now, not just to me, their voices overlapping in the particular way of people discovering shared language. And in that moment, I understood something Robert had known all along. The greatest protection you can give someone isn't money or legal documents. It's the knowledge that they are not alone. The new apartment has a window that faces east. I chose it deliberately. After 40 years in a house where the morning light came in from the side, slanted, indirect, the kind of light that suggests, rather than declares, I wanted something different. I wanted to see the sun arrive. Not the evidence of it, not the glow it leaves on walls and ceilings, but the thing itself, coming over the roofline of the building across the street, filling the window with a directness that still, 3 months later, surprises me a little every morning. I had my coffee, the good kind, the kind I make slowly, without rushing, because there is no one waiting for it, and nowhere I have to be for another 2 hours. I sat down at the small desk by the window. In front of me was a single sheet of paper. I had been thinking about what to write on it for several weeks now, turning the words over in my mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for the weight of it, the shape, the place where it fits. I had taught language for 4 decades. I understood perhaps better than most that the right sentence and the almost right sentence are separated by a distance that looks small and is not. I picked up my pen. I want to tell you something, not as a warning, not as a cautionary tale dressed up in tidy lessons, but as one woman speaking plainly to another, across whatever distance of years or circumstance may lie between us. I am 67 years old. I taught English in the Charleston public school system for 38 years. I have been a wife, a mother, a neighbor, a friend, a widow. I have sat with grief and outlasted it. I have made decisions that frightened me and discovered on the other side of them that I was still standing. And I have learned later than I would have liked, and in a harder way than I would have chosen, that the world has a particular tendency to underestimate women like us. I don't mean women of a certain age, though that is part of it. I mean women who have spent their lives in service to others. Women who have prioritized the needs of their households, their children, their communities, sometimes so thoroughly that the question of their own needs became unfamiliar, almost impolite. Women who were taught directly or indirectly that asking too many questions about money and documents and legal language was somehow unseemly, that these were details better left to someone else, someone more suited, someone who would handle it. I am here to tell you no one is more suited to handle your life than you are. I spent years believing that the people who loved me would always act in accordance with that love. That belief was not foolish, it was human. But I also know now that love and greed are not mutually exclusive, and that the most dangerous person in your life is rarely a stranger. It is someone who knows your rhythms, your routines, your trusting nature, and has decided for reasons that have nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with their own fear to treat you as a resource rather than a person. If you are sitting with a document you don't fully understand, sign nothing. If someone in your family is asking questions about your finances that feel slightly off, slightly too casual, slightly too persistent, trust that feeling. That if you find yourself being described to others as fragile, forgetful, or less capable than you know yourself to be, that is not a reflection of who you are. That is a strategy, and you are allowed to recognize it as one. Robert, my husband, who knew me better than anyone I have ever met, once said that the only real security in this life comes from knowing yourself so thoroughly that no one else can define you. He said it quietly, the way he said most important things, and I wrote it in a notebook and forgot about it for years. I remember it now every single morning. I believe God places people in our lives at the right moment. Not always the comfortable moment, not always the moment we would have chosen, but the right one. I believe that the neighbor who knocked on my door, the attorney who answered his phone on a Sunday, the woman who left an unsigned envelope in my mailbox, none of that was accident. Some things arrive exactly when they are supposed to. And I believe, with everything I have learned and everything I have survived, that you are reading this at exactly the right moment too. To every woman who has ever been made to feel like a burden, you are not a burden. You are the foundation. You are the one who kept the house running and the children fed and the family intact through every difficulty that came. You are the one who absorbed the hard years quietly and asked for nothing and gave everything. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not owe anyone your signature. You do not owe anyone access to what you built with your own hands and your own decades. What you owe yourself is this: to know your own documents, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to find one person, a lawyer, a friend, a neighbor, a stranger, in a community center workshop, and say out loud what you have been turning over privately. Because the moment you say it out loud, it stops being a suspicion and becomes something you can act on. If this story found its way to you, I hope you'll pass it along to someone who needs it. Not because it's my story. It isn't anymore. It belongs to every woman who has ever sat in a quiet room knowing that something was wrong and wondering if she was strong enough to do something about it. She is. You are. I set down the pen and looked out the east-facing window. The sun had cleared the roofline, now full and unhurried, filling the room with the kind of light that doesn't negotiate. I thought about a Wednesday evening not so long ago. A kitchen table, red pen in hand. Two voices in the hallway, low and certain. She'll never see it coming. Ryan was wrong. I saw it coming. I saw all of it, and I was ready.